We're recording. Hey guys, welcome back. This is Paige Hunter, and she is at SFU right now working on equity and climate change project, as well as some other things. She's just going to talk a little bit about her project and some of the things that she's working on. But before she does that, she'd like to make an acknowledgement. So I'll pass it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I just first wanted to begin this conversation with Ben by acknowledging and honoring the fact that I am an uninvited settler on the unceded Kwalin, Katzie, Matsqui, and Semiahmoo territories. And I would like to first off thank the host nations on the territory that I'm on for stewarding this land since time immemorial. I also want to recognize, as someone working in the climate justice movements, that the honoring and inclusion of Indigenous voices is one of the most critical things for both decolonization and climate justice. So thank you, Ben.
Awesome. Okay, so let's just start off by hearing a little bit about the history of your work with the project that you're working on now, and kind of how you got to becoming interested in the issues that you're interested in and the solutions that you're considering.
Yeah, okay, so I'll start with talking about where I'm coming from. Academically, I am in the School of Resource and Environmental Management within the Faculty of Environment at Simon Fraser University. And so it's a really interdisciplinary program where we look at the bridging the gap between the biophysical and the social sciences. And it also takes a systems thinking approach to resource management projects, as well as climate change. And I also am pursuing a certificate in geographic information science. And this, I think, when I was thinking about where I began working in climate justice and equity, it began a lot with thinking about spatial justice. One of my profs, David Swanland, introduced me to ideas of spatial injustice, both for axes of difference, including gender and race, and income as well. And this thinking about spatial justice.
Do you want to just define what spatial justice is for people who might not know?
Yeah, I can define spatial justice. So, for example, there is an open source mapping data set called, oh my gosh, what's it called? I can't remember what it's called right now, but it's where it's citizen science and citizen contributed data, and a lot of people use it for getting around and for mapping. But the issue with it is a lot of the data set is contributed by men, and so you have discrepancies where specific things that
Like it's disproportionate to the population size that it represents?
Population, for example. Yeah,
okay.
So daycare centers, for example, are not very well represented, but sports bars are really well represented on the map. So that's an issue of spatial injustice, where it's easier for, in that space, it's easier for men to get around than for women and non-binary people to get around in this space. So.
And is this like, is this a tool that's used in Canada specifically, or in different countries, or are there different ones for different countries? It's an international tool?
It's international, okay. And I cannot remember what it's called, but we can include it in the show notes after, and I'll
Sure,
find,
sure. Sounds good.
There's a paper on it as well.
Cool. So yeah, maybe we can include the paper as well. So you started working on this, your GIS background, was that what you originally started studying when you went to university?
No, that was something that I added on after.
You added it on after?
Yeah, so I'd taken a GIS course as part of the requirement for my resource management major. Mm-hmm. And then I'd never really thought about how we represent space. And so I decided to add on the certificate. And then I took on a course with David, which was a spatial ethics course that really got me thinking about, outside of just how we visualize data, who is visualized in the data, for example. And that, I think, is one of the first things that got me thinking about justice and equity.
Mm-hmm. So in this spatial mapping thing, you mentioned that one of the big problems is that it's not representative of the groups that it represents spatially. Yeah. And obviously, like any statistical method needs to be exactly proportional to
Hmm.
the percentage of different types of populations among like a number of different axes in order to be representative. Um, are there any kind of solutions that are being proposed for like collecting better census data, or like why was there a bias in the beginning? I'm guessing, like how can they be more representative moving
Yeah, so
forward?
the bias in the beginning would be from just the fact that the people that were interested in contributing the data or had the time to contribute the data
Hmm.
were people who identified as men of these certain demographics. Oh, it's called OpenStreetMap, by the way.
OpenStreetMap.
I just
There
remembered
we
what
go.
it's called.
Awesome.
Yeah, so it's an open source equivalent to Google Maps or Apple Maps.
Okay.
And but what they've started doing now, which is really exciting, is they do have mapathons or events where people can get together and spend a few hours together mapping space.
Mm.
And it's very community oriented. They make them into these events, and you get all kinds of different representations of that space. So that's one solution that people have come up with,
Hmm.
is creating intentional space for anyone to map what they want, so long as it's accurate.
Yeah. And maybe incentivizing women and non-binary people as well,
Mm-hmm.
or yeah, like underrepresented groups
Mm-hmm.
to contribute data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Cool.
sometimes there are like specific events for women to map space, for example, or for
Hmm.
non-binary people to map space, or people of color to map their communities, because you
Hmm.
also do see certain areas are mapped really well, and then certain areas in the same city will be not quite as well mapped.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And is that also like I imagine it would be related to like socioeconomic status as well? So like
yeah,
wealthier places are probably better mapped than non.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, because first off, it's you have the ability to you have the technological capability to do
Yeah.
the mapping, so you have access to a computer, um, and also you're mapping what you're familiar with, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So depending on your affluency, you'll map the areas that you know best.
That's really interesting. And so is this project something that you're personally working on as well? That's related to the ACT thing, climate equity project that you're doing, or is this just a tangential kind of thing that you were studying through your GIS?
This is just something that I was studying as part of my GIS certificate, and it's something that I really do just continue to be interested in just as a
Yeah.
hobby, because I find it so interesting, and it's also something that we don't really think about. It's not something you would think about in terms of,
No.
when you're looking at something that looks like Google Maps. Um, why would you question it? Why would you question the data that you're seeing?
Yeah, and that's like the whole thing with algorithms, right? Like they're super useful and they're super a lot better at giving us unbiased data if we feed it unbiased data, but
Mm-hmm.
also like um, any any algorithm is going to represent the data that you feed it, and if it's got a particular systemic bent or whatever, it's going to just reflect that in the outcome. And so that's just something I think that people are becoming more and more aware of, and also really important thing to be aware of when you're building, because
Mm-hmm.
these algorithms have a lot of power and they can shape how people think about things. And if they're not representative, then we're not thinking about things the way they actually are, and that's a
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah, well, because you'd have a completely different idea of a community if you looked at something um, that was only contributed by one particular demographic and that
Hmm.
who had mapped the city versus something that was mapped by a more holistic or representative group of people. It'd be two completely different communities that you'd be looking at, which is really interesting to think about.
Yeah, and I guess even when it looks representative on face value, like there's very salient things like gender or race that are
Mm-hmm.
pretty easy to be like, hey, this is underrepresented. This is underrepresented relative to the
Mm-hmm.
percentage of the population. But then there's a lot of other behavioral or temperamental differences that might also have a big kind of impact. So I feel like as you get better at those big picture problems, you can't stop trying to be representative. You have to continue to be representative more and more specifically as we get better and better at kind of understanding these differences. So it's a big scientific endeavor.
Yeah, no, it's so impressive, and I just want to thank all of the people that are working on this and are organizing these mapping events because it's incredibly important work, and it's kind of a thankless task in a lot of ways. It's just something to
Yeah.
do in your spare time often, and it's incredibly important.
That's really interesting. Let's shift a little bit to the equity project that you're
Mm-hmm.
working on. Just talk a little bit about what exactly the project is, and maybe just give a background on how you got to. I guess you were one of the people that was involved in making it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this project was done as part of a co-op or a practicum for my undergraduate degree with ACT, who are the Adaptation to Climate Change team at SFU, and they are, I believe, the first university-based think tank to be specifically dedicated to climate solutions at the local, regional, provincial, and federal scale. So
Wow.
some of the topics that they cover as an organization, yeah, they're
Is that in like the first in Canada or like one of
first in North America.
the first in
Sorry,
North America?
I should have said
Wow.
that. Yeah,
Take that,
yeah,
US. No, I'm just kidding. And Mexico.
yeah. And so some of the topic areas that we study, there's a team of it ranges anywhere from around 6 to 10 people at any time, both masters and undergraduate students. Looking at climate action specifically, that's the umbrella that we work under, but also looking at justice, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals,
Mhm.
how local governments can implement climate action, and also biodiversity, which is becoming increasingly prevalent, especially biodiversity loss. And before I get more into the project specifics, I do just have to say a disclaimer because I
That's
am
right.
a member of. I still work for the organization I did this project with.
Yeah.
That like the opinions and the things that I do say as part of this podcast are my own opinions, and they don't necessarily represent either the opinions of the Adaptation to Climate Change team or Simon Fraser University as a whole, because we are attached to the university. So I just wanted to make sure I got that out of there.
So if you mess up, it's 100% on you.
It's all me. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So the ACT project, before we did this podcast, you sent me a little bit of a write up on it that
Mm-hmm.
I've been able to read, but people who are listening to this don't have the background.
Yeah.
So maybe specifically, one of the major parts of the equity side was working with Indigenous voices. And so, do you want to just talk a little bit about um, how the equity side is tied into the climate change, and specifically, maybe I'll let you navigate how you want to
Yeah,
direct that.
for
But
sure. So I guess I'll start with talking just sort of how we got into
yeah.
specifically looking at equity at ACT, because it hadn't um, been so central to a lot of the work that we do.
Hmm.
So I began working on what we refer to as nature-based solutions, which are solutions for climate action that involve the integration of nature, whether it's existing or constructed, as a climate solution. So if a community, for example, is adjacent to a wetland, conserving that wetland for both carbon storage and water management would be a nature-based solution, for
Hmm.
example. And so I began by looking at how we can use those in Metro Vancouver to foster biodiversity, with the idea of creating a connected network of nature-based solutions and also green infrastructure.
So would most nature-based solutions be preservation, or is a lot of it trying to add in new like tree planting or building kind of rebuilding bio structures that would be beneficial?
So there's a really wide range of nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions include things like conservation or preservation, and they do include things that we consider green infrastructure, which is more what you were talking about constructed green space, whether that's an urban forest canopy or it's constructed wetlands. We see some of those in Vancouver in Olympic Village. They've built a
Mm.
constructed wetland there, which is really such a really awesome public space as well. Um,
Yeah.
and it can also be like rain gardens. And so it's an umbrella term for any climate solution that doesn't involve, for example, just like building a seawall, which is a very what we call gray infrastructure. So there's no real integration of biodiversity or nature or yeah. So that's I guess that's a good preface as well. I forgot to
Talk
say
about
that earlier on.
the gray structures. Are those kind of like middle level then? So it's like better than doing nothing, but worse than doing, or are they harmful in general?
It really depends because the production of cement has a huge
Yeah,
has a lot of carbon emissions,
yeah,
right? And so
one of the
there,
most.
yeah, it has one of the most intense carbon emissions, along with the smelting of steel as well,
Mm-hmm.
which is also often involved in gray infrastructure. So it's
It's like
what you would
20%
consider
of
to
climate
be,
of like carbon emissions or some
yeah,
crazy
it's
amount.
a huge amount,
Stupid. Yeah, yeah,
especially in North America. So
yeah.
that would be what we'd call maladaptive solutions, where say
Mm.
you're trying to prevent sea level rise, whether it's in Vancouver or any seaside community. So you build a seawall, but
So you're raising the temperature to try to
yeah,
prevent.
well, it
So
doesn't seem
it's
like
gonna make
much
it
for
rise. Yeah, no, no.
yeah. So
But
you end up
like the
yeah
logical thing is yeah backwards.
yeah, and so the other thing is that regardless of the carbon emissions, we don't necessarily know what the effects of climate change are going to be. So if
Yeah.
you expand your sewer network and your water management network by creating bigger pipes, well, what if now all of the storms that you're getting, the pipes can't handle that capacity of water, for
Mm.
example? So you've invested a lot, you've spent a lot of time, and you have the carbon emissions from the gray infrastructure that are fixed in space and cannot adjust to some of the climate impacts where nature-based solutions, because they're usually alive as well, and they're a bit softer or a bit fuzzier of boundaries between what they can take in terms of climate impacts, whether it's sea level rise or uh, vegetated riparian areas.
Mm.
It's a little more adaptive to those kinds of extreme events.
Okay, so it's more there's more uncertainty with these kind of gray solutions as
Mm-hmm.
to whether they'll um like there's interaction effects where it could cause an increase in
Mm-hmm.
this respect, but then it could make it worse in this respect.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the green based solutions that your project's mostly suggesting are
Yeah.
ones that are better at kind of there's it might not be like change the entire world, but there's
Yeah.
little chance that it will negatively impact overall kind of thing.
Yeah. So yeah, I
That's
think
super
one of
cool.
the things was specifically, I guess, a really good example was with False Creek in Vancouver. A lot of False Creek was historically just put into pipes underground.
Mm.
And so one of the projects that acted in, I believe, 2015 to 2017 was working with Burnaby and Vancouver to daylight a lot of these streams, which means essentially cutting those pipes in half and having vegetated areas on either side. So in that situation, if there was a huge rush of water, the water comes up through that vegetated area. The water can soak into the soil and get absorbed by the roots and then released later.
Mm.
But it's also able to go somewhere. Whereas if it's in a pipe, it can't really go anywhere. So you have, like backups and just really not awesome things that
Yeah.
happen.
And then you get probably more stagnant water
Yeah,
too, right? Which also I can't imagine is beneficial for health and sanitation
yeah,
purposes
yeah.
either.
Unfortunately, I mean, there are some examples where you can see extreme flooding in very gray infrastructure areas. I remember in Toronto a couple of years ago, they had some really very intense flooding as part of a extreme rain event.
Mm.
And since then, they've started implementing constructed wetlands and a lot of other green infrastructure to help manage stormwater floods or stormwater surges. Yeah, so that's been very interesting to see as well.
Yeah, and I imagine that with large cities too, that it's especially important to have them really close because the groundwater systems are probably just so, destroyed from the fact that there's just a bunch of massive buildings. Um,
Yeah, and cities are also very hard to do nature-based solutions in some ways because they're already built up, and so a lot of
mm,
what you're doing within the city involves, deconstruction, which can be very expensive. And also, it's just you have so much green infrastructure in the city already between, you've got hard buildings and, cement sidewalks and everything. So cities are a very complex place to work.
mhm.
But Vancouver has what's called the Rain City strategy, which is trying to use more green infrastructure in and around the city. And it's a really interesting plan, and I think I can also send you a link to that as well.
Sweet.
It's kind of recognized internationally as a pretty stellar stormwater management plan. So.
Yeah, yeah. Vancouver, from what I understand, has pretty good reputation too
Mm-hmm.
for the listening to and I guess it's been built a little bit later than some other major cities in North America too, but it
Mm-hmm.
does have like um a better approach to like integrating a green kind of space
Mm-hmm.
than a lot of other cities. Obviously, it's not good as good as it could be,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah,
so
Vancouver's good. Oh, sorry.
oh no, you go ahead.
Vancouver's good, but I just wanted to also mention that Surrey, the city of Surrey, is also doing a really fantastic job on this as well.
Oh yeah.
They have a really robust biodiversity plan where they've tried to make sure that all of the green space and all of the parks are connected to one another so that wildlife can travel in between safely without being at risk of getting hit by cars or trains, etc. So I just also wanted to say that Surrey, while kind of the unsung hero in both
Yeah.
climate action and nature-based solutions, um, are doing a really amazing job as well.
It's so interesting. I wouldn't have I guess that makes sense though, because if you
Mm-hmm.
drive down to the SFU campus on Surrey, there's
Yeah,
just like it's like it all seems to be connected. The park, and then
yeah,
it goes somewhere that I don't know, and it probably connects to the other one as you were saying.
yeah, yeah.
That's a really neat. Yeah, that's really cool. So, are you mostly working in the city-based solutions then, or are you trying to find solutions just um, in smaller towns or around big cities, or what? What?
What,
Help
like,
me out here.
where does this work?
Yeah.
Yeah, so um, with ACT, ACT has a separate team which is also called the Integrated Climate Action for BC Communities Initiative, and so the communities that I'm developing and the team is developing these equity approaches and these nature-based solutions for are of completely different scales. We did a presentation recently with the Rural Development Institute of BC, and you have communities there that have a couple hundred people or less that are still trying to do climate action and trying to implement nature-based solutions and incorporate equity. And then you have cities like Vancouver and Port Moody and Surrey as well, which are on a totally different scale. Um, and so the scale that we're working at is can be any scale really. And at this point, it's just focused on local communities, but hopefully also soon provincial or at the federal level as well.
So you guys mostly come alongside these people that are working in cities and help
Yeah.
with
So
different solutions, and that's kind
yeah,
of the plan.
yeah. Usually we work with people who are either consultants hired on specifically to do climate action, whether it's climate adaptation, so trying to um, minimize the impacts of, say, sea level rise, or climate mitigation, which is trying to reduce the emissions in, say, a municipal's vehicle fleet.
Mm.
So we sometimes work with consultants who specialize in that area and they're hired by the municipality to do this work. And so there's kind of a connection there. Or in some cases, municipalities have started hiring people specifically for these jobs. Like there's more roles for climate planners or um, climate adaptation specialists within cities. So it's a very exciting area to be working in. And so we usually have someone that we liaise with between the municipality and our organization.
Cool. So are some of these you mentioned some people that there's more positions that are kind of being created,
Mhm.
that municipalities are hiring. Are a lot of these like urban planner type positions then, or they're like urban planners but like climate based urban planning, or is it just like solutions to things that have already that they're trying to
Mhm.
implement, like the green based solutions?
It can be a lot. There's a lot of different ways that municipalities and local governments will approach it. Sometimes it is through the planning lens. You'll have people that are climate planners, and
Mm-hmm.
they're looking at what's the climate impact of the city, and how can we do the best that we can with the resources that we have. So there are people that are more specifically focusing in that area, but then there's also people that are just, they're not necessarily planners, but you'll have people who are policy analysts.
Mm-hmm.
They're coming at it from that side where they're examining how um, policy government will affect climate action for better or for worse. And then you also have people who are like asset managers who are either engineers or any number of potential backgrounds in terms of asset management.
Mm.
And you also have people who are working in finance doing this as well. You have people who are accountants, and um, yeah, it can be any number of people as well.
That's super cool. So
Yeah,
it's seeming to be growing then in terms of
yeah,
the
it's
amount of
very
people
exciting.
involved. Is I know this is like maybe a bit of a tangent question from your project, but
Okay.
is you mentioned a lot of the people working are hired by municipalities and in policy based solutions. Is
Mhm.
it has it expanded into like the private sector much in the Lower Mainland Vancouver area, as far as you know, in terms of climate based solutions, or is it still mostly just the public sector that is
Mhm.
implementing these?
So I guess in terms of, not in terms of solutions, but in terms of, I guess, the positions being created, um, because a lot of my work is focused on the local government, so I don't see a whole lot of the private sector.
That
But we
makes
are
sense.
seeing, just as a student who's always, learning about what my friends are doing in their jobs, there are a lot of private sector organizations who are creating positions for climate analysts or policy analysts to specifically see how their corporation is incorporating climate action into what they're doing. And we're seeing, for example, General Mills is doing a lot of work with regenerative agriculture in the prairies and trying to minimize their impact that way when they're creating their products. So there's a lot of really quite huge private sector organizations who are starting to finally listen and finally
Yeah.
finally start incorporating uh, climate action at all levels of their organization. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's super good to hear. Okay, so do you want to talk just a little bit more? You were starting to talk about
Yeah.
the equity side of things, and then we got a little
That's okay.
sidetracked just with the implementation strategies, which is
Yeah.
always interesting. But
Mhm. Yeah. So I began working specifically looking at biodiversity and regional green space and natural areas, and then in uh, that was last spring, so spring 2020. And then in summer 2020, we saw the growth of the movement for Black Lives and the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, as well as many other people who weren't necessarily of that same media profile. And so this really, um, I think, made a lot of people question the way that they were thinking about the work that they do, whether regardless of what sector you're doing, what sector you're in, and really realizing that the experiences that we have because of our privilege are not necessarily what everyone is experiencing. And so within ACT, we were thinking a lot about, who are we doing climate action for, and who are we developing these policies for, right? Because if you're not embedding equity and justice into your climate action, what's the point, really? Why are you protecting people who already have had advantages in the rest of their life and neglecting these people who have historically been divested? And so that, I think, is really what caused that shift in how we center equity in
Hmm.
everything. You know?
Yeah. So you said like, what's the point if it's not um, centered on equity?
Mm-hmm.
Um, is that just saying like, what do you, maybe just explain a little bit about what you mean by
Yeah.
that?
So if you're trying to develop specifically with nature-based solutions, you're trying to develop um, a space where people can gather outside safely, for example, during COVID, or a
Hmm.
space where they can gather under a tree canopy during a heat wave in the summer. Um, you really need to be thinking about who needs that, for example, who needs that green space, and who might already have access to it because, for example, say they have access to it on their private property. Right? So in terms of green space, if you have people that live in a more suburban area where they're able to have gardens and able to have trees and able to have that shady green space where they can cool down, they don't really need the city to implement a park like that in that area because that
Hmm.
need is already met. Whereas people living in the downtown east side who have living situations that are not very climate resilient, where we see a lot of people during heat wave events either getting hospitalized because of heat sickness or passing away because of the intensity of the heat events, that
Hmm.
is where you need to be putting that investment, and that is where you need to be uplifting that community and keeping them safe.
So like focusing on more kind of historically redlined districts or
Yeah,
areas that have uh, a disproportionate impact due to climate change.
yeah,
um, when you're allocating scarce resources, you can't build
yeah,
it everywhere. You have to choose which ones, and so that's what you mean
exactly.
by like trying to focus on those areas. Okay, that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. Yeah.
Well, it would also be, for example, if you're talking about investment planning for a local government, they would be wasting those resources if they were to put that park in where people already had access to those
Because
outdoor
they wouldn't
spaces
get
on their
used
private
as much, the
property. They wouldn't
parks.
get used. Exactly. That's the thing. There's no real need for it, right?
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so the city of Vancouver has begun this project called VanPlay, where they've applied GIS, they've applied geographic information science, and mapped out areas of the city where those spaces are needed, where there is, known higher heat and also lower green space, and typically lower income as well. And that is where they're planning in the next, I believe, I can't remember how many years, at least 15 years,
Cool.
to be investing in those communities.
Yeah, that's so it's more of like a data driven solution based off of like the you mentioned the OpenStreetMap earlier, and it's
Yeah.
similar kind of programs that are
Mm-hmm.
data sets that they would use
Yeah.
to determine which areas are more in need of green spaces, and then focus the resources on building in those areas.
Mm-hmm.
With the bigger picture thing being, hey, we also have to stop global warming and
Yeah.
mitigate climate change. But like, if we're on the micro level, this is the best way to go about it. That will
Yeah.
also help equity.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So it's
Yeah.
like killing
Feeding
two
two
birds
birds
with
with
one
one seed.
feeding. I should change that. Yeah, that seems a little intense, but that is the saying. I
Yeah.
have to say that
Yeah.
I like yours better though.
Yeah. One of my profs said that because she's like, "Why would you kill two birds?" And I was like, "Well, fair
Yeah,
enough."
I don't know. I never want to kill two birds. Now I feel
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's in terms of
Aw.
it's partly in terms of the data. It is partly data driven, but also um, a really important part of it is public engagement as well, which is where a lot of the equity issues come up. So, in terms of this project, I started thinking about who we're building nature based solutions for, right?
Hmm.
And because obviously in Vancouver, you see different, definitely differing access to green space, and also
depending on location.
depending on location, and also you see a difference in property values that's associated with that, where you see more affluent areas in Vancouver
Yeah.
having more access to green space, whether it's street trees or public parks. So
And that's probably
that's
true everywhere, no? Like
it
I'm trying to
is.
I'm trying to think of a place where it's not like that. It seems,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, a really stark example that I saw this summer, going back to how we began talking about this, is when people were visiting the memorial for George Floyd outside of Cup Foods in Minneapolis. During the heat wave event, there was so little green space in this neighborhood that's faced, decades and decades of divestment, that
Mm-hmm.
people were, mourning the loss of a community member, and also there's the weight of large that are at play.
Sorry, you
They
just
were.
glitched out a little bit there for a second.
Oh, no worries. What was the last thing I said?
You just were talking about the divestment in Minneapolis.
Yeah. So when people were at this memorial for George Floyd in a historically divested area, they were facing more extreme heat in this heat wave, and that area of the city was 15 degrees Celsius hotter than the non-redlined areas of the city,
Mm.
which really was kind of a very striking example of multiple system level factors that tie into justice in general, but specifically looking at climate justice and the environmental factors that people are facing because of histories of racism. Really, this is a historically redlined Black neighborhood that you know you can
Mm-hmm.
see all of these things showing up that make it so obvious that there's a bias in terms of investment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So with the ACT program
Mm-hmm.
in Vancouver, um, it's mostly academic, right? In terms of
Yeah.
you guys are coming up with solutions, and then policymakers are the ones that at this point are implementing or not
Yeah.
implementing them.
Yeah, because we are largely a research institution,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we will a lot of the implementation side is through working with these local governments,
Mm-hmm.
and also through conversation with, like, we have a lot of people coming to us asking questions about, how can we do climate action, whether it's in a private sector or the public sector.
Mm-hmm.
And so we aren't necessarily doing the implementation, but it's more or less trying to constantly be producing new research, and also um, influencing decisions, possibly through speaking at events. My supervisor is pretty much almost constantly speaking at international conferences. During COVID, that's all been virtually.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, mostly just trying to influence policy, and then the implementation side is kind of out of our hands at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, but we were talking a little bit before this, and I get the sense that your program or your project, one of the major kind of, I guess, innovations that it has is a way of thinking about having these kind of slightly non-economic solutions in a way, because part of the reason why a lot of historically divested areas are historically divested is like statistical associations with rates of crime, or like
Yeah.
it's hard to invest in the area. But your programs, one of the main things that you guys are trying to do is to, even though it's maybe like in terms of if you're trying to make a profit, it might be counterproductive.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying like if we invest here,
Mm-hmm.
then it will cause like a ripple effect that will then make the place better for investment. So in a way, you're kind of acting as a keystone. I was talking with my friend Joseph on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he was talking. He's from Haiti, and he was talking about
Mm-hmm.
instigating investment in Haiti
Yeah.
through building keystone kind of uh, elements of a sector in a society,
Mm-hmm.
because obviously it's hard to invest if even people like in Haiti, it's a good example. Like even people there don't want to invest there; they want to invest
Yeah.
elsewhere. So
Yeah.
how do you cause better investment there, right? And so I maybe want to talk a little bit about how your project approaches that side
Yeah.
of
So
things.
yeah, we were really. It's a very fine line that we were walking because we have to be incredibly careful. Um, because you do see cities that are implementing nature-based solutions or even just trying to develop parks for people to go to. You see this happening a lot with the New York High Line, for example. That was um, where they tried to use some old railroad track in the city to create more green space in a historically divested neighborhood. But through a lot of the different factors of how they went about it, it ultimately caused a huge kind of domino effect of green gentrification, where the people that were living in that area before who really needed that green space could not afford to live there anymore. And the rent and the cost of property is now 35% higher than before that project was undertaken. So it's a very fine line in terms of trying to
Mm-hmm.
find effective allocation for public investment from a local government, but also being very careful about how private investment is occurring, right?
Yeah.
Because you ultimately want people to be able to stay in place and experience the benefits and the investment of nature that you're putting in these communities. But a lot of times, because through a variety of factors, there's a lot more speculation or private development in these areas and private investment. And that's when you have displacement and gentrification. And then, then it's just green space for people that would typically have access to it anyways at that point. So it's
Yeah.
a fine, fine line. But
Yeah.
also a caveat
That's
to that,
challenging.
yeah, a caveat to that is that private investment isn't evil and bad because, it depends on
No,
what
of course not.
it is and
I mean, without
who's
private
for.
investment, like the rapidly declining like global rates of mortality and global rates of
Mm,
sickness and like I mean COVID exception of course, but
yeah.
like yeah, you need it. But you're right, like even though it might benefit on average, it still can displace people
Yeah.
that are the very people that you're trying not to
Yeah.
have displaced. And then
Yeah,
it's
and
like,
it's incredibly tough. And I was having a really interesting conversation this morning um, with a member of BC Healthy Communities, and he was trying to. Um, we were talking about this incredibly complex because we're both kind of trying to focus on equity. He's coming from more a human health standpoint, whereas I'm coming from a climate standpoint.
mm-hmm,
But the difficulty of building equity through nature um, when you have local governments and municipalities that are having all of their revenue come from property tax, for example. So there will always, at this point, there is always a bias in a local government to encourage private investment and an increase in property values in these areas where they're putting their money, because then when
they
they
get more
invest,
money.
then they
Yeah.
get more money. And so it's a very, it can often be a very frustrating area to work in because
Yeah.
you know the
But
city of.
it's like it's such a fragile system too, though, because you break it and then you get no money and then you can't do
Yeah.
anything. So it's like you
Yeah,
got
and
to be
it's.
careful. Like you can rebuild it better, but you can't break it and just say that it's bad because,
Yeah.
they tried getting rid of private investment. And I mean, like Mao and Stalin and many other people can
Yeah,
attest to
those can
that
go
didn't work
different
over very well.
directions.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, again, going back to the city of Surrey, they have often been criticized for a lot of the housing development that has occurred there.
has
But
there been a gentrification process a lot in Surrey too?
not
I'm
that
not
I'm
really
aware
familiar.
of.
Yeah,
Not
I
that I'm aware
haven't.
of. I haven't looked into it that much. But I know
Hmm.
people have been just critical of, you know, certain kinds of housing development in Surrey. But at the same time, that's probably one of the reasons why they're able to do all of this climate action and conservation
Yeah,
work, because that's where their money comes from. That's where the funding comes from to hire people to do this work. So it's
It's
a very
tricky.
complex,
And
yeah.
there's also the problem of um as you mentioned, like how the private investment manifests itself can actually backfire, but equally probably, even maybe more probably, how the policy is implemented can backfire, right? Like
Yeah.
you can implement a policy that's supposed to cause X and it does the exact opposite because
Mm-hmm.
of unforeseen factors. And so,
Yeah.
but yet when we vote on politicians, they're in for 4 years or however many years.
Yeah.
So by the time the ramifications of their policy have come to fruition, it's
Yeah.
a new person in, and nobody's talking about that anymore. And so we have to
Yeah.
be a little bit aware of these um, long-term impacts of things as well, which we are becoming, especially with like, intergenerational impacts of, say, discrimination of
Yeah.
some sort. We're becoming more aware of that, but
Yeah.
it's
And
so
specifically with
complicated.
climate, historically interest has definitely gone like up and down. It's very tied to the political cycles and who's in power and who's influencing or creating policy. Um, but hopefully, at all, we're seeing more, in the very least, acknowledgement of um, the fact that we are in a climate crisis and we are seeing multiple levels of government implementing climate policy, right? So we're starting to see it become more consistent, which, it's kind of the 11th hour, but it's better than nothing.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you can get everyone on the same page of solutions, I'm kind of a disproportionate optimist, as I told Paige before this thing, but I think a really good example of this is the 1970s. There was a lot of like climate activism, and they were like, we're going to run out of fossil fuels and all these things.
Yeah,
And what happened was private sectors innovated because the economic costs changed to reflect a demand in certain
exactly.
things. And that's
Yeah,
what happens when you allow people who are typically pretty smart, I think, if you give them the chance, and don't need to be, like, people are pretty capable and pretty resilient even in like really really tough situations to like rise above, and not just be like a victim of their situation. So I think the problem can be, like you said, that it's always going to be an 11th hour thing because we're only like, innovating just enough to like not die or whatever.
yeah. At
So
this
we
point,
we
yeah,
need to just maybe get a little better at our
yeah,
foresight, but I don't know, that's a challenging topic to
yeah,
like, how can you tell what's going to happen in 20 years or 50 years or 300
yeah.
years?
And a lot of policy is very reactive, because
Mm,
especially if you're working with elected officials, you have your constituents saying this thing happened, we need you to do something about it after it's happened, and trying to create proactive policy that's
yes.
applying the precautionary principle and trying to minimize the impacts of climate change when you don't necessarily. I mean, we do have a lot of data about what is what we are pretty certain is going to happen. Like, we know Vancouver is going to experience more extreme heat in the summer, for example,
Hmm.
and that we're going to have less snowpack in the mountains,
But
and
the thing
more rain.
you can't predict is how innovation will
Yeah,
match that, and that just becomes
exactly.
challenging because that is like,
Yeah.
there's almost like those two variables are kind of interconnected, right?
Yeah, and you only are dealing with the technology that you have at the time. You don't know where innovation is going to go.
Yeah,
I guess
like half of us could be on
specifically,
Mars, who knows?
yeah, or like with the 1970s, that was when people really, there was a boom in fracking and natural gas and all that kind of stuff, which was, as you said, not economically viable beforehand.
Yeah, like
And
the oil sands wouldn't have been, it was just like Canada wouldn't have been able to, and also in Saudi Arabia.
yeah,
And then once that starts, you also get like all sorts of environmental ramifications as well. So it's just,
yeah,
it's like you said, it becomes so messy that it's
yeah,
easy to just choose one variable and say this is the correct variable, and like
yeah,
everyone should be focusing on this. But that's what I really love about your project is like you're working on these solutions, and you're aware of like, hey, there's so many different things that are going on here, but
mm-hmm.
we got to be proactive and
Yeah,
um try to get a better solution that is not just fixing a problem but evolving better, right? Like you're evolving
yeah,
into a more equity-based kind of
Yeah,
solution of of your project.
yeah. I mean, it's really interesting because a lot of equity work has to be proactive, but the fact that we're doing equity work is reactive to the fact that we're
People
a
are
lot of us are
wanting it.
just now realizing that there's huge systemic injustice.
Yeah.
You know, so it's a very interesting area to be working in where
Yeah.
you have to deal with history, but also you have to be
Yes.
working for the future. So,
And recognize that this is the first time in history that we've that people have actively been like, hey,
mm-hmm.
I'm oppressing other people. Maybe I should
Yeah.
stop. Like, when in history has anyone ever said that? People have just always been
Mm-hmm.
knocking each other down, and now people are starting to say, hey, like, this isn't sustainable and it's not ethical, which is,
Yeah.
you know, a
Yeah.
big shift.
We've seen huge social movements in the past, whether it's the civil rights movement or the movement for Black Lives. But I think you're right. This is one of the
Yeah, I'm talking more like the last couple
first.
hundred years or the
Yeah, this
last
is
500 years, maybe.
yeah, this is definitely one of the um, at least as far as I'm aware of one of the more widespread examples of you know people like us acknowledging that you know wow I am there are things that I need to realize about myself and how the things that are part of my privilege impact other people. You know.
And more importantly, there are things that I can do to help
Yeah.
instigate a
Exactly.
better future, because we could sit here and talk about all sorts of nice sounding things, and
Yeah.
we talked a little bit before about how kind of academia is so useful a lot of times, but sometimes it can dip its toes into the pool of brainyism and
Yeah.
just not actually like making solutions that help the people that need
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. In academia, a lot of the things it's the ivory tower of academia where it's
Yeah,
like, you know, when you really start squabbling about which solution's best or whatever, and then it's like, well, why don't we just do something, right? You can
yeah,
you can make as many models as you want, you can map as much as you want, but ultimately, if you're not doing anything, like why are you fighting in a journal about whether X is better than Y, right?
just so you sound smarter than the other person.
It's an ego thing, I think. It's in most of the
Yeah, well, I think that's just another thing.
yeah.
Like, I mean, I'm biased as a neuroscience person, or a person who's very interested in neuroscience, I guess. I don't know what a neuroscience person is. Um, um, but I think that acknowledging that bias is something that every single human being on the planet has, and that
Mm-hmm.
every single human being has bias towards specific things that are specific to that person,
Mm-hmm.
that's just super important to recognize and to be like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, I'm perceiving the world in a certain way. There's other people who perceive it in a different way. And I
Yeah.
think that academics, that's the word, academics often have the bias of wanting to sound intelligent because they've spent
Yeah.
so much of their life building this reputation.
Yeah.
And it's hard. I mean, I get it. You go through like 700 years of grad school where you don't make any money, and then
Yeah.
you're like, I know this, I'm an expert. And it's
Mm-hmm.
true, but at the same time, a lot of studies show that dart throwing monkeys are better than experts at predicting certain outcomes. So
Yeah.
it's like, your expertise is helpful, but at the same time, acknowledge that you're not as infallible as you think.
Yeah, and as we were kind of talking about before we started recording, humility is a huge part of equity work, and it's also a huge part of um, any sort of climate action. Like realizing it's really important to realize that you aren't necessarily the most knowledgeable person in the room, right? And that's
Mm-mm.
something that is yeah, it's important in climate action, it's important in equity, and it's important in pretty much all aspects of life, especially when you're working in the realm of public engagement and trying to be focused on communities. There's so much knowledge that's inherent in a community, and there's so much leadership and deep knowledge that we don't have and we might not even know about. And so to approach a
Yeah.
situation with humility will ultimately give you a better outcome and also will help you build relationships as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and something that I've the last few days actually really like thought about the because I'm a kind of, you might have guessed listening to this so far and through our
Yeah.
conversation, I'm kind of a data person.
Yeah.
I like to know solutions, and I
Yeah.
think that's very useful. But at the same time, there's a very different way that I recognize that I need to think about things when I'm talking to
Mhm.
like one person, as opposed to when I'm like at a spreadsheet trying to see like what is the
Yeah.
optimal way to like minimize the amount of like things that are going to happen. Because you have to be pretty heartless to look at the data and just be like, okay, like how many people are going to die, let's minimize it, like,
Mhm.
but needs to be done, someone needs to do that, so we need people that think that way. But
Mhm.
at the same time, you need people that can have conversations and talk to people, and
Mhm.
one to one, and you never want to approach a one to one conversation just as like
With data.
completely like, well, the data doesn't
Here are the
support that or something.
facts.
Yeah, exactly. um
Yeah.
yeah, but there was something you were saying that I wanted to touch back on. I can't for the life of me remember what it was.
Um, well, I had something that I just thought of in terms of data off
Okay,
of
why
what
don't
you
you
were
start
just
with that
saying.
and I will
Just
think
keep
about what I was
thinking.
going to say. Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of data, one of the other things that I've come to realize as well is that, you can quantify a lot, surprisingly, but also um, in terms of what data you're using, you need to be acknowledging that it doesn't represent everything. I know you're a very data oriented person, and I'm probably like poking you a little bit, but especially in terms of climate action and equity, for example, the importance of Indigenous knowledge is completely crucial and needs to be centered in terms of how you're making decisions, and also in terms of intersectional policy building. But how do you put that in a spreadsheet, for example?
And you might not
Because
even want to,
it's
right?
not
Like,
appropriate to. It's completely inappropriate to be
yeah.
taking someone's um, something that someone has shared with you, whether it's in confidence or um, they've allowed you to share it as well. It's totally inappropriate to reduce that to a number,
And
for
even if you
example.
are trying to like reduce like the number of voices that get heard to be a representative,
Yeah.
like how does that work? Like, are we representative of like the population, or are we countering like are we including variables that account for the fact that certain populations have been underrepresented in the past and maybe they
Yeah.
should be overrepresented now to like compensate for that?
Mm-hmm.
So, even if you are a complete dataist, then there's no like one solution. And even if you're a
Yeah.
complete like I reject data and I'm all about,
Mm-hmm.
personality, there's also not one solution. So
Yeah.
I think that the only thing that hopefully everyone can agree on is that different voices being heard and truly listening is
Yeah.
beneficial to everyone.
Yeah. And I mean, you need to have things that are quantitative and measurable when you're doing a project, for example, um, because otherwise, how will you know if you've been effective? But also, you need to be cognizant of the fact that that doesn't show everything.
Hmm.
And I really, as part of this project on equity and nature based solutions, I was really fortunate to work with Grant Falgren, who is the chair of the Reconciliation Advisory Committee for the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects. And he's also a member of the Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation in Ontario. And he definitely has changed several of my perspectives about how we do projects and um, who who leads projects, especially because if you're trying, there are several projects that he had experienced in Ontario where they were trying to revitalize native ecosystems, for example, and so different nations in Ontario had been engaged to um, figure out which plants were to be included and what the ecosystem would look like when it's restored. But following the the project manager and the company that was implementing the project, once they'd put all that stuff in, there was no involvement of the nations on that territory in terms of continuing
Consulting and
managing it.
stuff.
Yeah, there was no they were not involved except for that one time, right?
Mm.
And they weren't necessarily allowed access to that area.
So it was more like they
Um,
saw it as checking a box in terms of getting
Checking the
them involved
box
or something.
for sure.
Mm.
And that's a lot of the issue with public engagement right now is you
Yeah.
have, especially in Canada with Indigenous communities, you have histories of broken trust and trauma from um, settler communities and settler colonial governments. And also in non-Indigenous communities who are historically divested or marginalized, often face that checkbox, one and done kind of engagement where they're just sort of asked what they feel and then not included throughout the process. So it's that I think is probably one of the biggest things that needs to change. And that was one of the things that I was really wanting to touch on in my conclusions in my research, such
Mm.
as thinking about, you know, when you're doing a project, it's about building relationships. It's not about just getting your project done, right? So making sure that when you're doing any sort of public engagement, it's long term and that it's throughout the whole project process and after the project is done, which is very
And that
different from
you're
how we
growing into something rather than just like,
yeah.
saying, I guess that's one thing too, where the stories are so much better of an is so much better approach to just use
Mm-hmm.
stories than to try to quantify everything, because
Yeah.
you need to understand where everyone's coming from, and it's hard to do that if you just have a method and then you say you can be involved as long as you like do our method.
Yeah.
And I think that it comes down to like changing hearts and changing people's opinions on things.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost sometimes counterproductive to yell at them, because then people just become like
Yeah.
resentful, and they're like, okay, I'll like check all the boxes, but
Mm-hmm.
they don't truly grow into something.
Mm-hmm.
um and then the slower method of like exposure, and having exposure seems to be the best way to really become less discriminatory and less biased, just to like listen to people and be exposed to different ways of life throughout
Mm-hmm.
your life.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you just have one view of the world,
Yeah.
and then any other view is just ignored or whatever.
Yeah. And I think there is a project that has done this kind of relational engagement and equity work really well in Washington D.C. It's
Mm-hmm.
you have there's two neighborhoods in DC where there's you have the famous Capitol Hill, and then you have a neighborhood across the river called Anacostia, and
Mm-hmm.
these two neighborhoods have never really mixed a lot because there wasn't really a pedestrian overpass to get to um, Capitol Hill or to Anacostia, and they were separated by a river, the Anacostia River. And so you have one incredibly wealthy community, and you have one divested community that's largely families of color. And so there was a big push by the DC government to connect these two neighborhoods. And so they started this project called the 11th Street Bridge Project, which was to build a pedestrian bridge alongside
Mm.
redoing the old car bridge and traffic bridge. But one of the things that they did as part of this project was they already, the nonprofit that was leading it, which was called Building Bridges Across the River, which was created specifically for this project, they realized that if they did not do any sort of community action and just put the park in, all these people in Anacostia would be displaced. Whether it's from people from Capitol Hill moving across the river or from outside investment. And so 5 years before they planned to start building the project, they initially focused on making sure that people in Anacostia were able to secure safe housing. And as they were going about this project to create low-income housing or just different kinds of affordable housing, they realized that a factor in people being able to secure housing was having meaningful work. And a lot of people in this community were either unemployed or were employed in kind of boom and bust industries where they would be sometimes not working for long periods of time. And then they also realized that from that, it became this very systems level approach to building equity before this project even began. So they had 5 focus areas of housing, small businesses, meaningful employment, arts and culture, and I believe environment as well, which came from the park. And so they spent, they had this whole equitable development plan that was centered on community. And when they were doing any sort of engagement, they made sure that they were paying key stakeholders for their time, which meant that they were able to spend more time together, and people were actually really giving them meaningful feedback. And for stakeholders who came to more public open houses, they were not necessarily paid, but they were compensated through providing childcare, so people with kids could come to these meetings, and also through providing, you know, meals and food as well. And so really trying to meet people's needs so that they were not facing any barriers to giving feedback on this project. And so the project hasn't been built yet. I think the setbacks just because of COVID in terms of the construction, but they've basically developed a community land trust where that land will be held in perpetuity for low-income housing. They're also seeing a huge growth in small businesses, and during the construction, most of the people working on the project will be employed from that community. So things are looking good, but that's an example of, you know, how much time it takes to do that kind of relationship building.
And then like, yeah, that's a really cool project. I'm really interested to see how that turns out. Yeah, that's the other thing with those projects is like you said, it takes so much planning, and then you do it, and inevitably there's going to be at least one thing that you miscalculated on, but hopefully like the many failures of the past is like getting better and better, and that this one will be like a really, it sounds really well thought out, and it could be like a very successful
one of the things that
approach.
I'm hopeful for is the fact that they are going to continue working, this nonprofit is going to continue working in the community after the bridge is built.
It's a nonprofit that's running it.
Yeah, it's a nonprofit, and then they collaborated. The bridge itself was part of the project of the DC government, and then all of the community-centered action was led by Building Bridges Across the River, which is a nonprofit, and then that was done in collaboration with the DC Department of Housing and the DC Department of Health, for example. So it was
super cool. So it's like a hybrid, like market and government-based solution that could be really cool.
Yeah. So I'm really
hopeful,
maybe cautiously optimistic, you know, because I think they've really put the work in, and they've taken the time to build these relationships. And the fact that they are going to continue working on it after the project is finished is something that you rarely see. You know, even if you do all this work, it's kind of once it's done, and whatever happens, happens.
It's like anytime you're building a relationship, right? No matter what the relationship is, it's if it ever transcends the point when you're building it, it's probably going to grow stagnant pretty quick and get bad. That's super cool. Yeah. And does this project have a specific name, or is it just the building the bridge?
It's just called the 11th Street Bridge Park, or the 11th Street Bridge Project.
Okay, so, cool. That's super cool.
That one's that's kind of my shining example of people that, at least so far, have really done equity work very, very well.
And is there like a university that's working with this as well, or is this just like completely a policy and what do you call it, private sector hybrid?
I believe there was, I don't know if the university was directly involved, but I know there was a research team that was specifically focused on data development and the quantitative side of this project, because their whole thing was, you know, what gets measured gets managed, and what gets measured gets done. And so that was also a really good hybrid where they were trying to quantify well-being, for example.
That's a really hard thing to quantify, by the way, for people who don't know.
But at the same time, they were also working with the community directly, and they had a whole more community-focused team. and measuring where it's appropriate, really. So
Mm.
I believe there was a team of university students and researchers who were involved in that, but I don't know which university it was. I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah.
Super cool. That's super cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, is there anything else that you want to say about the ACT project? If not, I have a couple other questions.
I think that was pretty much it. And so I guess the outcome of that project. So ultimately, it was about 6 months of research,
Mm-hmm.
and which led to me working with Grant and with another project manager from the city of Vancouver, who worked on that Van Play park investment and recreation investment plan I was talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And so the three of us, along with my supervisor, Deborah Harford, we did a webinar in November, which was really exciting because we had people attend from all across Canada. We had 164 attendees, which was really
Wow,
exciting.
that is
Yeah.
exciting.
And so since then, we have developed this policy briefing, which you read, Ben, and it's been exciting getting calls from people about this work. I was really excited to hear from you, and I've talked to several master's students and different organizations about this work, and yeah, so we're starting to see some increasing interest in this area.
Yeah, I'm so excited to hear like where this is going, and I know it's in the early stages of the
Mm-hmm.
implementation, um, but I'm super interested to hear where it goes. So definitely keep me posted
Yeah.
as you guys continue to work through it. Um, okay, so I just want to switch gears a tiny bit
Yeah.
to your kind of big picture thoughts on impact and
Yeah.
your impact through work in climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you're young and don't necessarily know exactly what you want to do with your career, but if you have maybe a few things you could touch on, and
Mm-hmm.
we've already talked a lot of it about some of those things through your equity and ACT work. So, but maybe just talk a little bit about that.
In terms of where I want to go in the future,
Yeah.
and what's out there, I mean,
Hmm.
the very exciting thing about working in climate, especially as a young person, is that there's new positions every day that you never would have thought of, and new areas to work in that you never would have thought of. Like I've recently learned the amount of um, sustainability and climate action involved in, for example, the beauty industry. Like, so it's very
Yeah.
interesting seeing all of these things popping up. And you were asking me before this call if I wanted to continue working in research, and I think I'm a little hesitant, as I said before, because I find that luckily with ACT we are integrated with communities and are seeing some of our research acted out on the ground. But I think longer term, to keep working in academia, um, I don't know if that's where I want to go because I feel like it's very separated from communities. Um, and right now, one of the things I've really, the area I guess I've really started to care about, it's not specifically climate related, but it's environment related, and that is Outdoors for All, which is a movement in the US and kind of becoming international. And I heard about this through a drag queen that I follow on Instagram called Patagonia, like Patagonia.
No.
And so,
Patagonia.
yeah, I know.
There you go.
And thinking about, you know, she really works a lot in climate action, but also has really stated that if you don't really have a connection to the planet, or you don't really have a connection to nature, it's very hard to get people to care about climate policy, for example. And
Which
so,
might be why you see so much, I mean, relatively speaking to the rest of Canada, North America,
mm-hmm,
like I'm not maybe as familiar with this on the rest of the world. I imagine it would be the same.
mm-hmm,
But like Vancouver and Victoria, you see like a lot more interest in climate
yeah,
issues. And it makes sense if you've ever hiked in Vancouver or
yeah,
Victoria. And like every person is like, you know,
mm-hmm,
a lot of people are very, very outdoorsy, very interested in connecting with
yeah,
nature.
yeah. And so, Outdoors for All is focused on um, making sure that, like, when people of color go outdoors, sometimes they're more likely to be approached by park rangers, for example, more likely to be questioned about whether they should be camping in an area. And so it's trying to create safe spaces for people of color, or for any number of axes of difference. So whether it's ethnicity or even ability as well, making sure that people who use a bunch of different any number of mobility aids, whether it's wheelchairs or walkers, are also able to experience wilderness, in at least some capacity.
I've noticed that in a lot of the hikes around Vancouver, there seems to be, I mean, there's certain things, obviously, like you can't necessarily make a super challenging hike wheelchair accessible. That was the word. I was like, this is an obvious word, I can't remember it. But a lot of like walks and hikes that have really scenic views have been kind of, the paths have been widened and like routes removed and stuff for accessibility, so that's kind of cool.
Yeah, and it's something that, as you say, not all spaces will be accessible for all people necessarily, but trying to at least have some spaces, because,
we're not going to try to like cut down Everest, be like, it's too hard for some people, like let's get rid of it. It's like, no, it's part of the planet. But
making sure that people are able to, ultimately it's about safety, access, and making sure that people feel safe going outdoors. Like, even as a woman, I don't necessarily feel safe hiking by myself, but what can we do about that? How can we create safe spaces where women and children can go hiking and not feel threatened? Like, if for example, can a single mother take her child out in the wilderness safely, right?
So what kind of solutions, like adding lights onto trails? And I guess that would also kind of diminish the nature value.
Not necessarily adding lights. It's just about what a lot of people have done is create hiking groups, for example, or hiking networks. This isn't necessarily a career path, but it's an area where I am really interested
in like what how it will evolve and how it will grow.
Or if you're looking at park rangers, making sure that your hiring strategy for park rangers is also intersectional, and that you're also offering people, you're trying to attract a variety of different people to these parks management positions as well. And also in terms of parks planning, the integration of the Indigenous nations whose territory the park is on in terms of the park management is one way of doing that. There's a lot of different inroads to approach that, but I'm just interested mostly in how access to the outdoors improves people's engagement in climate action.
Seems like a theme is being aware of the myriad of effects that everything is subject to, and trying to, come at it from a really rational kind of approach, but also recognize that, like, hey, there are certain things we can do, even though some things are mind-bogglingly complicated.
And everything, it's definitely tough working in this field in one way, because, well, I say it's tough, but I have nothing to complain about, really. But everything that I'm doing in terms of equity and justice, I can only really view it through where I'm coming from, and through the lens that I have because of certain privileges that are part of, have historically been part of people who look like me. And so it's trying to really understand and get outside of yourself to understand what other people are having to deal with, right? In these spaces, whether it's the outdoors or in cities as well.
Super cool. Well, it seems like it's a really interesting project, and definitely fascinated to see how it will progress. I just have one last question that I've been asking everyone on the podcast. So the theme here is kind of stories, but I guess everything's a story. And as we kind of talked a little bit about in this so far, that, your story is interconnected with the stories of everyone else, and that's another That's another idea that's really beautiful. I think that we're not necessarily as aware of in Western weird societies, as they would say in psychology, Western educated, whatever that thing is. But the question is that if you could tell one story or spread one message that would get through the noise and really reach people and really resonate with them, what story would it be that you would want everyone to be aware of, or that you would want to reach everyone?
I think I was thinking about more particularly like something that I think I want people to know in terms of a message is that when you're working, there's an incredible importance in, and there's an incredible power that you have as a person in terms of influencing action. And oftentimes you are more powerful than you know, whether it's taking action in your community or having conversations with your peers. And another thing that I was thinking of in terms of specifically working in climate is it can get really exhausting working in this field, and it can get really, you can feel kind of like you're not really doing anything. And so I think the most important thing to do would be to find stories of hope and trying to keep that hope within yourself, because and finding stories where people are taking action and creating positive change, because it is happening, and it's incredibly hard to find those kinds of stories, but that's what's going to keep you motivated, and you can do so much, and anything you do is important. And so stay hopeful and stay motivated, and you can
Work
do a lot
hard.
more than you think. Yeah.
I love that. That's a great message. Thank you so much for coming on, and have a good one.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in to episode 13 of At the Base of the Baobab Tree featuring Paige Hunter. Join us for episode 14 coming soon.